Whispers could wound deeper than claws, and in the Hall of Moonstone that night, every whisper carried the same verdict: worthless, fallen, ruined. 6 months pregnant, she stood at the edge of a celebration built for someone else, buried under laughter that wasn't meant for her. They believed she'd come to be broken. None of them knew a king was already searching the kingdom for her face. Hannah Weir smoothed trembling fingers over turquoise silk that had been let out twice since spring, the fabric straining gently over the curve she could no longer hide. She stood just inside the great doors, half in shadow, listening to hundreds of voices layered over strings and harp, the whole hall glittering like something built to remind her of everything she wasn't. Moonstone Hall had been built for nights exactly like this one. Soaring pillars wound in silver ivy, 1,000 candles bleeding gold light across marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the banners of 2 great houses hanging side by side above the dais. Tonight it celebrated the claiming of 2 powerful bloodlines. Hannah had not been invited to celebrate anything. She wasn't there to be welcomed. She was there to be watched, a cautionary tale in turquoise silk, swollen with the child everyone in that hall had already judged, put on display so the wealthy could feel a little taller standing next to her. An unmarried, pregnant Omega. In a kingdom that raised its Omegas to be modest, obedient, and claimed by an alpha long before a child ever showed, there was no lower place left to stand. Hannah had grown up understanding the rule, without ever needing to be told twice. Speak against an alpha's word, and lose whatever was left to lose. Her family's name was already stripped bare. Her father had died still believing the worst of her. All that remained was the child beneath her hand, and whatever dignity she could hold on to for 1 more hour. Look at her, someone murmured behind a fan of jeweled fingers. She actually came, an Omega, unclaimed, carrying some rogue's bastard, and she shows her face here. Someone should have kept her in the servant's wing where she belongs. Hannah kept her chin low, and her eyes on the polished floor. She had learned months ago that answering back only made the wound bleed longer. Near the dais, Lord Garrick Valor stood in ceremonial black, heir to the Stormfang territory, waiting to claim Lady Rosalind Maris in front of the only world that had ever mattered to him. He had once promised Hannah something entirely different, in a different season, before her condition became too obvious to explain away, and protecting her stopped being convenient. Rosalind reached her first, red hair gleaming above crimson skirts, like a warning brought to life. "You should have stayed hidden," she said, looking Hannah over the way one might inspect a stain on good linen. "I was summoned," Hannah answered quietly. "Yes." Rosalind's smile didn't reach her eyes. Garrick wanted his guests to see exactly what happens when an Omega forgets her place. Laughter rippled through the nearest guests, soft and satisfied. Garrick climbed the ceremonial platform and lifted his goblet, and Hannah felt the room's attention swing toward her like a blade finding its mark. "To bloodlines," he said, "to loyalty, and to honorable unions." His gaze found her deliberately, and he let it linger. Some people seem to believe that carrying a child entitles them to a respect they never earned. More laughter. Warm, easy, cruel. Her cheeks burned. Some small, stubborn part of her wanted to walk straight out of that hall and never return. But leaving would only prove every unkind word right. She pressed her hand harder against her belly, the one place she still felt steady, and said nothing at all. Then, from somewhere near the back of the hall, a voice cut through the noise, bored and needling, and delighted to cause trouble. "If the child's father is so honorable, why has he never once come for her?" The question landed like a struck match. Hannah had no answer. She had asked herself the same thing every night for 6 months, curled around the ache of it in the dark, and she had never once found an answer that didn't end in, "because he never truly wanted you." She had believed, once, that her life was changing. It happened at the Festival of Falling Stars, one stolen night in the moonlit gardens, with a scarred stranger who had impossibly gentle hands, who called her beautiful, and danced with her beneath the lanterns, as though she were something worth keeping. He had promised to find her again. Then he vanished before dawn, and weeks later she understood exactly why it no longer mattered. She was still holding that memory, still bracing against the laughter, when the enormous doors at the far end of the hall slammed open, with a sound like thunder splitting the sky in half. Boom! Every voice in Moonstone Hall died at once. A line of armored guards strode through the doorway, silver cloaks embroidered with a black crown wreathed in flame. Behind them walked a man who made even the proudest alphas in the room straighten without meaning to, bare-chested beneath a heavy fur-lined mantle, an old scar cutting across one shoulder, arms marked with battle ink, dark hair braided back from a face built out of warnings. No one needed to be told who commanded those guards. Even the boldest nobles in the hall dropped their eyes, as though meeting his gaze by accident might be enough to end them. Nobody had summoned him. Nobody had expected him. The Alpha King had come anyway. Garrick nearly lost his footing on the platform. "Your Majesty." The king didn't answer. His golden eyes moved through the crowd, searching, sliding over jewels and silk, and lowered heads, as if none of it mattered at all, searching for someone. Hannah felt the air go still in her lungs. Then his eyes stopped. On her. The most feared king in the realm went rigid at the sight of a disgraced, pregnant Omega standing alone near the doors. And for one suspended heartbeat, the terrifying stranger everyone in that hall believed they understood simply forgot how to move. His nostrils flared. He drew one slow breath, and something in his expression cracked wide open. Hannah's heart slammed against her ribs. That scent. Cedar, rain, smoke after lightning. She knew it. She had dreamed of nothing else for 6 months. His gaze dropped once to the curve of her belly, then rose again to find her eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice low and disbelieving, it carried across the entire silent hall. "Hannah." Gasps rippled through the crowd, like wind through dry grass. Somewhere behind her, Rosalind's confident smile had already vanished. And Garrick, who had spent 6 months burying the truth of who Hannah really was, finally understood that the ground beneath him had just disappeared. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. For a long moment, no one in Moonstone Hall dared breathe. They knew this man, not personally. No one outside his own war council could claim that, but by reputation. And reputation in his case was worse. King Theron Varkesh had never lost a battle. He had swallowed 3 rival territories before his 25th winter, and spent every year since turning away every noble family in 6 kingdoms who dared offer him a daughter. He didn't attend balls. He didn't accept invitations. He certainly didn't appear, unannounced, at another lord's claiming ceremony, with his guards at his back and his cloak still dusted from the road. And he had never, not once, in all the years since he took the crown, spoken a mate's name in public. Garrick understood, before anyone else in that hall did, exactly how badly his night had just gone wrong. "Your Majesty, we weren't informed you would." Theron didn't look at him. He hadn't looked away from Hannah since the doors opened. He catalogued her the way a man memorizes something he's terrified of losing twice. The swell of her belly beneath turquoise silk, the way her shoulders had curled inward, as though the room's laughter had physical weight, the hand pressed flat and protective against herself, the fear in eyes that still refused to look fully away from him. Then the scent reached him properly, and every calculation in his mind went silent at once. Cedar, rain, smoke after lightning. He had chased that scent through 4 territories, described it to trackers who thought him half mad for hunting a smell instead of a name, lain awake more nights than he'd admit, certain he'd imagined the whole thing, a woman who existed for one night and then simply stopped existing. She hadn't stopped existing. She had been standing in a corridor a day's ride from his own border, laughed at by people who would have knelt for her if they'd known what she carried. 6 months rushed back at once, sharp as the first time. The festival of falling stars, torches strung through the gardens like captured constellations. He had slipped away from his own guard for one selfish night, tired of being a crown before he was a man, and found her instead. A girl who'd slipped away from the servants' quarters for one stolen hour, dancing barefoot in the grass like no one had told her she wasn't allowed to be happy. He hadn't told her who he was. He hadn't wanted to be looked at the way the whole world looked at him, only to be, For one night, the stranger who made her laugh. He had called her beautiful, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. He had held her until the stars gave way to grey morning light, and before he left her sleeping, he had sworn, to her, to himself, that he would come back for her. He had meant to. Then word came of an attack on his eastern border, and by the time he could breathe again, she was gone, and no one in the servants' quarters would say where. He had spent 6 months believing he'd lost her to indifference. He had never once considered that someone had taken her from him on purpose. Garrick found his voice again, thinner now. Your Majesty, whatever you believe you're seeing, this Omega is disgraced, unstable. She's told half this hall her child belongs to some rogue she can't even name. Enough. The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It rolled through the hall like pressure before a storm, and every noble near Garrick took an unconscious step back, as though proximity to him had suddenly turned dangerous. You will not speak of her again, Theron said, until I have decided whether you're permitted to. Garrick's mouth closed. Theron crossed the hall. Guests parted without being asked, the way water parts for something too large to argue with. He didn't stop until he stood in front of Hannah, close enough that she had to tip her chin up to hold his eyes, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, like a hearth she'd forgotten she was allowed near. He reached up and unclasped the heavy fur-lined cloak from his shoulders. Then, in front of every noble house in the kingdom, he wrapped it around her, swallowing the faded turquoise silk in black fur and warmth, and settled one broad hand near the curve of her belly, not touching, just close enough to ask permission with the space he left. Hannah's breath caught somewhere between her ribs. It was you, she whispered, so quietly it barely left her throat. Something in his terrifying face broke open, gentle and unguarded, in a way none of the watching nobles had ever seen on him. I have been looking for you, he said, every territory, every season since. I thought I'd lost you to the world, Hannah. Then, softer still, meant only for her, and heard by everyone anyway. My love. The hall didn't gasp this time. It went utterly silent, the kind of silence that follows something sacred, and Hannah felt 6 months of held breath finally break loose from her chest. Tears slipped free before she could stop them. Not from shame this time, but from something she hadn't let herself feel since the morning she woke up alone. Theron's thumb brushed, feather-light, along her jaw, catching nothing, asking everything. Who did this to you? He asked, quiet enough that it should have been private, and somehow still carried to every corner of the hall. His golden eyes lifted from her face, and found Garrick. Across the room, Garrick Valor felt the floor tilt beneath him as the truth finally landed. The woman he had spent 6 months trying to bury was standing in the Alpha King's cloak, beneath the Alpha King's hand, looking at him like she already knew exactly who to blame. Theron's gaze held Garrick one heartbeat longer, long enough for the threat to land, before it dropped back to Hannah, and this time it found her hand. She hadn't realized she was shaking. Her palm lay pressed flat over the curve of her belly, fingers trembling against turquoise silk, an old habit worn smooth by 6 months of bracing herself against whatever came next. Is he well? Theron's voice had gentled, though it hadn't grown quiet. The child. Is he healthy? Hannah's throat closed around the question. Hundreds of nobles stood frozen around them, straining not to miss a word, and she had spent 6 months learning exactly which answers would be used against her. She hesitated, searching his face for some sign of what he wanted to hear, then decided she was done offering anyone a softer version of the truth. They say he isn't yours to ask after, she said quietly. They say he belongs to some rogue I can't even name. That I lied my way into this hall tonight to save what's left of my family's ruined name. Something shifted behind Theron's eyes. Not doubt, never doubt, but a fury banked so deep it barely reached the surface of his face at all. Look at me, he said, and when she did, he reached toward her slowly, giving her every chance to step back. She didn't. His hand settled beside hers, broad and warm, over the swell of her belly. The child kicked, hard and sudden, directly beneath his palm. A ripple moved through Theron's whole body. His jaw tightened. His golden eyes darkened, something ancient and wordless surfacing behind them. His wolf had already known. Blood called to blood, the same way scent had called him, across 4 territories and 6 months of silence. Near the dais, an elderly healer, who had traveled with the royal guard for 20 years, stepped forward unbidden and dropped into a bow. "Your Majesty, the bond mark is unmistakable. That child carries royal blood." The hall didn't gasp this time. It forgot how to make any sound at all. Theron straightened to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice filled every corner of Moonstone Hall without needing to rise. "That child is mine." Silence cracked open into chaos, hushed voices colliding at once, fans snapping shut, someone near the back sitting down hard, as though her legs had given out beneath her. "He is the heir to my throne," Theron said, and let the words land like a verdict. "The next Alpha King of this realm grows beneath the hand every one of you mocked tonight." Hannah felt the room's axis tilt beneath her feet, the belly they'd whispered about, the disgrace they'd paraded her into display, all of it inverted in a single sentence. Somewhere to her left, one of the women who'd laughed loudest an hour ago was already sinking into a stiff, hurried curtsy, eyes fixed on the floor. Garrick found his voice first, though it cracked on the way out. "This is madness. She seduced some nameless wanderer and dressed the lie up prettier once she learned whose favor might save her." "Then why?" Theron said, turning on him slowly. "Did you spend 6 months making certain I never learned she existed?" The hall's noise died again, faster this time. Garrick's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I never told you where she was," he said finally, too quickly. "I didn't know you were looking." "I never said I was looking for her by name." Theron's voice dropped, quiet and lethal. "So tell me, how did you know exactly who I was looking for at all?" Garrick said nothing. The silence answered for him, and Theron let it sit there, unresolved, a blade he wasn't finished drawing yet. Beside the dais, Rosalind had gone the color of old parchment, the ceremony meant to bind her to Garrick, already forgotten by everyone in the hall but her. "Your Majesty," she said, stepping forward, red skirts rustling. "I want it known. I never took part in her mistreatment. Whatever Garrick has done, I had no part in it." "You laughed," Theron said, without looking at her. "An hour ago, in this very hall, you laughed with the rest of them." Rosalind's mouth closed. She said nothing further. Theron turned back to Hannah, and everything hard in his face softened again, meant only for her. "I thought you abandoned me," she whispered, the words finally breaking loose, after 6 months of swallowing them whole. "I woke up alone. I waited. No word came, no letter, nothing. So I told myself you'd only ever wanted one night, and I was foolish enough to have believed it meant more. I never abandoned you." His hand found her jaw, careful, reverent, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't felt fall. "Not for 1 hour of one day. Something kept us apart, Hannah, and it wasn't my choice, and it wasn't yours." "Then what was it?" "I don't know yet." His voice roughened. "But I will find whoever made you believe I'd left you. That, I promise you." He held her a moment longer, memorizing her face the way a man memorizes something he'd nearly lost twice. Then his eyes lifted again, and this time all the warmth drained out of them entirely. He looked at Garrick the way a king looks at a man already sentenced, who simply hasn't been told yet. "Start talking." Theron didn't wait for Garrick to answer. He lifted one hand, and the royal guards fell into position, along every door of Moonstone Hall, silver cloaks blocking each exit, until the great chamber had become something closer to a courtroom than a ballroom. "No one leaves," he said, and though his voice barely rose, it reached every corner of the hall regardless. "Not until I have what I came for." Garrick's eyes cut toward the nearest door, and found only armor. "Your Majesty, surely this—" "It requires exactly this," Theron said. "Start from the beginning." He turned back to Hannah first, and the fury banked behind his eyes softened, redirected rather than gone. "6 months ago, word reached me the night after the festival," he said. "Rebels had burned 2 villages along my eastern border. I rode out before dawn. There was no time to find you myself, so I did the only thing I could." He remembered writing it by candlelight, his hand unsteady in a way it never was on a battlefield. Parchment naming him plainly, King Theron Varkesh, and nothing less. He wrote of his intention to claim her the moment the fighting ended, promised guards would come for her, gave instructions for where to wait and who to trust. He sealed it with his house crest and handed it to a courier he'd trusted a dozen times before. "I told you everything in that letter," he said. "Who I was, what I intended, that guards were coming." His jaw tightened. "It never reached you." "There was no letter." Hannah's breath caught. "I waited by the servants' gate every evening for a month, before I let myself stop." Theron's gaze swung back to Garrick, and this time the guards didn't need to hold him in place. He looked like a man who'd already lost the will to run. "You knew," Theron said. "Tell them how." Garrick's throat worked before anything came out. "I saw her leaving the gardens the morning after the festival. There were guards watching the tree line. Royal guards. I'd seen that formation once before, escorting your court through Stormfang. I knew exactly who she'd been with before she did." "So you intercepted my letter?" Silence answered him. "Say it." "I paid the courier," Garrick said, all the ceremony day polish gone from his voice now. "Told him the girl he sought had already left the estate. It wasn't difficult. 1 purse of silver against a delivery no one would ever think to confirm." Hannah stared at him, something between grief and disbelief crossing her face. "Why? What could you possibly have wanted from me worth this?" "I wanted you before I knew what you were," Garrick said. "A fallen house. No protection, no leverage. I thought you'd be grateful for whatever I offered." His eyes cut toward Theron, bitter. "Then I saw the guards, and I understood exactly what I'd almost lost, and what you'd become the moment anyone else learned it. I couldn't let that happen. Not to a woman who'd already told me no once. So, this was never about protecting your pride," Theron said quietly. "It was about making certain she never had power enough to refuse you twice." Garrick said nothing, which was answer enough. "I never knew you would actually find her," he said instead, some fight returning to his voice. "1 letter, 1 courier. I thought it ended there. I never imagined you'd hunt a scent across 4 territories like a man possessed. You knew exactly what you were doing." Theron's voice dropped, colder now than Hannah had yet heard it. "You didn't gamble on distance, Garrick. You gambled on my grief, wearing thin before my patience did. You lost. 1 purse of silver buys a courier's silence for a season," Theron continued, eyes narrowing. "Not 6 months. Not through 3 inquiries my own men made into that courier's route since." His gaze swept over Garrick like a blade deciding where to fall. "Someone protected this far longer than you could have managed alone. Someone closer to my household than you've ever been." Something in Garrick's composure finally cracked. Not guilt this time, but fear of something larger than himself. "I didn't act alone," he admitted, quiet enough that the hall had to strain to hear it. "Someone inside your own courier network made certain that letter never left Stormfang's border. I was never given a name, only told the matter would be handled. And it was." The silence that followed felt colder than anything before it. Theron let his eyes move once across the nobles lining the walls, slow and deliberate, promising every one of them that this inquiry had only just begun. "Take him," he said finally. 2 guards stepped forward and closed around Garrick's arms. He didn't fight them. Whatever defiance he'd carried into the hall that night had drained out of him completely, leaving a man who understood, far too late, exactly how far his jealousy had reached. Theron watched him go. Then he turned back to Hannah, and every hard line in his face eased at once. She was still trembling, cold, or 6 months finally unraveling all at once. She couldn't have said which. He didn't reach for her yet. He simply waited, leaving her the space to choose. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted. "Relief, anger. I don't know if I can forgive 6 months disappearing, even now that I understand why." "Then don't." His hand rose slowly and settled against her cheek. "You don't owe anyone forgiveness tonight. Not Garrick, not the crown." A pause. "Not even me. Whatever you feel, you're allowed to feel it exactly as long as you need to." For the first time since the doors had opened, Hannah let herself lean, just slightly, into his hand. Theron didn't let her stand in that hall a moment longer than necessary. "The ceremony is finished," he said, loud enough for every noble still frozen along the walls to hear. "Return to your homes." No one argued. No one dared. He kept one arm settled protectively around her as they crossed the marble floor together, his height and breadth shielding her from the hundreds of eyes still following her every step. She kept her hand cradled beneath the curve of her belly, chin lifted now instead of lowered. Near the dais, Rosalind stood frozen in her crimson gown, red skirts pooled around her like spilled wine, watching the wreckage of her own ceremony walk past her without a word. Behind them, guards flanked Garrick toward a side door, his arms bound, his eyes fixed on the floor he'd once made Hannah kneel on. No one laughed this time. Outside, the night air hit her skin like something clean after the hall's heavy perfume and candle smoke. A royal carriage waited at the base of the steps, black lacquer gleaming under torchlight, the same crowned flame emblem stamped into its doors. Theron opened the door himself before any guard could reach it, then offered his hand, waiting until she took it, before he helped her up the narrow step. She settled onto the cushioned seat, and immediately felt the walls of the carriage press closer than they should have. A different kind of hall, a different kind of cage, dressed up finer than the last one. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, quieter than she meant to. Theron climbed in across from her, close enough that his presence filled the small space entirely, and seemed to hear everything underneath the question. "You are not being taken to my palace as a prisoner," he said. "You are coming home." I don't know what that word means anymore. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. The last place that called itself my home taught me exactly how quickly a door can close. Something in his face gentled further. He reached for the folded blanket beside him, then paused, holding it out, rather than draping it over her himself. "May I?" She blinked at the question, small, and somehow larger than anything else said that night. She nodded, and he laid it carefully over her lap, tucking the edge near her feet, without letting his hands linger anywhere she hadn't invited them. "Why did you search so long?" she asked, watching him settle across from her. 6 months. You're a king. You have a kingdom to run, wars along your borders, 100 better uses for your time than chasing a scent. I searched 4 territories, he said simply. I questioned merchants who traveled your roads. I sent scouts into towns I'd never had reason to visit before. I followed rumors that led nowhere a dozen times before one finally led somewhere. He paused. I kept nothing of you but a description of a scent and the sound of your laugh. It should not have been enough. It was. Why? Because I have led armies, Hannah. I have made decisions that cost lives, and slept through the nights that followed them without much trouble. His voice roughened. The only night I couldn't sleep through was the one where I woke up and you were gone before I could tell you who I was. The carriage rocked gently into motion, wheels finding the road beneath them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore, she admitted finally, eyes on her hands rather than his face. Not after everything. I don't know how to hear someone say home and love without waiting for the floor to disappear. Theron didn't reach for her. He simply held her gaze, steady, patient, nothing in his expression asking her to feel anything faster than she was ready to. Then don't trust me today, he said. Let me earn it tomorrow. And the day after that, for as long as it takes. Something in her chest loosened, just slightly, at hearing it put that plainly. He shifted forward slowly, and this time he did ask, a small tilt of his hand toward her belly, waiting for her nod before he let it rest there, warm and careful over the blanket. The pup kicked almost immediately, sharp and certain, directly beneath his palm. Theron went still. Then, for the first time since the doors had crashed open in Moonstone Hall, he smiled. Not the terrifying, battle-worn expression the nobles feared, but something boyish and unguarded, entirely new. He's strong, he said, quiet with wonder. He kicks like he's already angry at the world, Hannah murmured, and surprised herself by almost laughing. They rode the rest of the way, in something closer to peace than she'd felt in 6 months, the fortress rising slowly out of the dark ahead. High stone walls, crowned in torchlight, banners of black and flame snapping in the night wind. When the carriage finally stopped, Theron climbed out first and turned to help her down, his hands steady at her waist, careful of the weight she carried. The great doors of the fortress opened before they'd even reached them. Servants and guards alike lined the entrance, and at the front, an older woman in fine grey wool dropped into a deep curtsy, her eyes warm rather than judging. "Welcome home, Your Majesty." Hannah froze, certain for a moment the words were meant for Theron. Then she realized every eye in that doorway was fixed on her. They were already bowing to their queen. The fortress welcomed her more warmly than she'd expected, and judged her more coldly than she'd hoped, often within the same hour. The household staff seemed determined to erase, plate by plate and gown by gown, every trace of the woman who'd once stood alone in Moonstone Hall. Seamstresses arrived within days, measuring her for garments in deep turquoise and silver, colors that would one day mark her a queen. But the corridors held other eyes too, older alphas in council robes who watched her cross a room the way one watches an unwelcome storm gather on the horizon, murmuring behind their hands about omegas and thrones, and what the old laws had never intended. She learned quickly which of them belonged to which category. 3 weeks after her arrival, Theron brought her into a council session for the first time, seating her at his right hand, without asking permission from anyone in the room. Not every face welcomed the gesture. Chancellor Odrin Pell was the first to say so aloud. Elderly, silver-haired, his voice honeyed with decades of practice at sounding reasonable while saying something unkind. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing Theron as though Hannah weren't seated 3 feet away. "No one questions the bond between mates, but a king's consort carries weight beyond the bedchamber. Perhaps, given the circumstances of her arrival, a more politically advantageous match might still be considered alongside." "She is not a match to be considered," Theron said, his voice already dropping toward the register that made lesser men reconsider their next sentence. Hannah touched his arm before he could say more. "Let me answer him," she said quietly. Theron stopped. Something flickered across his face. Surprise. Then something warmer beneath it. And he sat back. She turned to Odrain, chin level, hands folded over the swell of her belly. "Before my family's collapse, Chancellor, I managed our estate's accounts for 3 years. Grain stores, worker wages, trade agreements with 2 neighboring territories. I balanced ledgers my own father couldn't read without a candle and a headache." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "So before you decide what political weight I do or don't carry, I'd ask what weight you've carried yourself, beyond a council seat and an opinion." A ripple moved through the room. Not quite laughter, but close enough to unsettle Odran's composure. He inclined his head stiffly and said nothing further. Later, alone in his study, Theron watched her trace one finger down a ledger of the kingdom's outer territories, frowning. "Something troubles you," he said. "These numbers are wrong." She turned the ledger toward him. 3 territories reporting grain shortages, yet their noble houses claim full harvests in their tax filings. Someone is diverting resources before they ever reach the people who need them. Theron studied the columns, then studied her. "Show me." She did, patiently, methodically, the same quiet competence she'd once used to keep her father's failing estate breathing, long after it should have collapsed. By the time she finished, Theron sat back slowly, something recalibrating behind his eyes. He hadn't merely found his mate in that hall 6 months too late. He'd found someone who could help him rule. "You'll sit in on every council session from now on," he said. "Is that an order, Your Majesty?" "It's a request." The corner of his mouth lifted. "I'm told I should practice those more. Poorly so far. I've had less practice with requests than with armies." She laughed, surprised by the sound of it, unfamiliar after 6 months of swallowing everything down. Over the following weeks, he taught her the old customs of the royal pack, the weight of names and bloodlines she'd need to know. She taught him, in turn, how his own tax decrees landed on families who'd never had the luxury of reading fine print twice. He listened. He adjusted policy on her word more than once, and pretended, badly, that it wasn't because he trusted her judgment completely. She was slowly learning, a terrible liar when it came to her. The first note arrived, tucked inside a basket of linens, unsigned, the handwriting deliberately plain. A queen who rises too quickly can fall just as quickly. She read it twice, then folded it small, and said nothing to anyone. Court was full of jealous whispers. She'd survived worse than paper. The second note arrived 4 days later, slipped beneath her chamber door sometime in the night. This one was different. Inside, alongside the same careful, anonymous hand, lay a torn scrap of parchment. Aged, creased, half a wax seal still visible at its edge. A seal she recognized instantly, because she'd seen its twin pressed into the cloak Theron had wrapped around her shoulders the night everything changed. A fragment of his handwriting curled across the torn edge, cut off mid-sentence. "Come for you myself, once the border." Hannah sat very still, the scrap trembling between her fingers. Someone out there still had the rest of it, and they wanted her to know it. She waited until nightfall to show him. Theron turned the scrap of parchment over in his hands, his expression shifting from confusion to something colder as recognition set in. His own handwriting, unmistakable, ink pressed slightly heavier in the places where he'd written in a hurry 6 months ago. And beneath it, the broken curve of a wax seal, his house crest, split cleanly down the center, as though someone had cut it deliberately, rather than let it break by accident. "This is mine," he said quietly. "The letter I wrote you that night." "Someone wants me to know they still have the rest of it," Hannah said. Theron's jaw tightened. "Then someone has kept it 6 months, waiting for the right moment." He launched the investigation before dawn, quiet enough that half the fortress never noticed. Guards he trusted absolutely combed through courier logs and old correspondence, tracing every hand that might have touched that letter between his and its intended road. It took 11 days to find a name worth following. It led, improbably, to Chancellor Odrin Pell. Odrin had served 3 kings before Theron, his loyalty a fixture of the crown, longer than Theron had been alive. Brought before Theron, in a private chamber, rather than full council, his composure didn't crack. "Your Majesty, whatever accusation brought me here, I assure you it's mistaken," he said smoothly. "I have served this crown faithfully for 40 years. Then explain the correspondence between your seal and Garrick Velos," Theron said, setting a stack of letters on the table between them. For the first time, something flickered behind Odrin's composure. He didn't deny it long. Faced with his own hand written plainly across every page, denial became a wasted performance, and Odrin was too practiced a courtier to waste effort on a lost argument. "I didn't do it for Garrick," he said finally. "I did it for the kingdom." "Explain that," Theron said, "before I decide how much patience I have left." An Omega Queen, untested, carrying scandal into the bloodline before she'd even reached your gates. Odrin's voice took on the same honeyed reasonableness Hannah remembered from the council chamber. "I believe this kingdom needed an alpha bride from a territory strong enough to secure your borders through marriage rather than war. Garrick's interception simply bought time to arrange a match you'd eventually have accepted, once grief wore thin enough. So you let her believe I'd abandoned her," Theron said, voice gone dangerously quiet. "For 6 months, to buy room for a bride you'd chosen without my consent. I did what any advisor sworn to protect this crown would have done. You did what no one sworn to serve me had the right to do." Odrin's gaze shifted to Hannah, his tone sharpening into something closer to his true feelings. "Look at her, Your Majesty. Socially damaged. A pregnancy already wrapped in scandal before she ever wore your colors. Noble houses across 3 territories murmur rebellion at the very idea of an Omega on your throne. The bloodline requires a queen with political weight behind her name, not merely your heart." "I've heard enough," Theron said. "I only ask you to think clearly. You don't fear that I am weak," Hannah said, and both men turned toward her at once. Her voice didn't shake. "You fear that I will never obey you the way a politically arranged bride would have. That's the truth beneath every argument you've made tonight, Chancellor. Not the kingdom's strength, your grip on it." Silence settled over the room, complete and absolute. Theron looked at her for a long moment, not with the desperate hunger of a man who'd finally found his fated mate, but with something steadier, closer to reverence. "She's right," he said. And she's correct that I have chosen her, not only because the bond named her mine, but because I've watched her manage a ledger better than half my council, answer cruelty with more grace than I could, and speak truth to a man 40 years my senior without flinching. He turned to Audran. That is the queen this kingdom needs. You were simply too afraid of losing your grip on the crown to see it. Audran said nothing further. There was nothing left to say. Take him, Theron said, and guards closed around the Chancellor's arms. The relief lasted only until a rider reached the fortress gates near midnight. Half frozen, his horse lathered from hard riding. Theron met him in the courtyard himself. Garrick has escaped custody, Your Majesty, the rider said, breathless. He took 3 loyal warriors from Stormfang with him. Scouts tracked them riding north, toward the fortress. Toward Hannah, Theron said. The rider shook his head. Word from Stormfang says he's no longer trying to reclaim her, Your Majesty. Theron went very still. He means to kill the heir before the child is ever born. Winter arrived early that year, or perhaps the storm simply chose its moment with precision. Snow battered the fortress walls within 3 days of the rider's warning, and beneath its howl, scouts confirmed what Theron already suspected. Garrick was closer than anyone wanted to believe, and he hadn't come alone. Hannah had reached her final weeks, the child low and heavy inside her, her body counting down toward a different reckoning entirely. She stood in the war room anyway, watching Theron move markers across a map of the fortress grounds, with the same controlled fury she'd first seen in Moonstone Hall. You'll remain in the inner keep, he said. Not quite an order, though it wanted to be one. Sealed, guarded, away from any wall that could fail. I can do more than hide behind one. She met his eyes steadily. I know these grounds now. Which stores feed which quarter? Which families have children too small to move quickly? Which corridors flood first if the well towers are struck? Let me coordinate the evacuation, at least. Let me be useful, instead of merely safe. He wanted to refuse her. She watched him want to, and watched him remember instead everything she'd already proven since the night he'd found her. The ledgers, the council chamber. Audran's arrogance answered without a single tremor in her voice. Stay within the inner walls, he said finally. But yes, coordinate it. She spent the night moving between storerooms and family quarters, directing supplies and steadying frightened mothers with the same quiet competence that had once kept her father's failing estate breathing. It was its own kind of battlefield, and she didn't flinch from it. The breach came near midnight, through a stretch of eastern wall weakened decades before either of them was born. Garrick's men poured through the gap like floodwater, and Garrick himself came looking for exactly one person. He found her in a corridor outside the inner keep, breathless from 3 flights of stairs, one hand braced against the stone. You look well, he said. For a woman who ruined everything I built. You ruined it yourself, Garrick, long before I ever refused you. If I cannot have the life that should have been mine, he closed the distance, voice low, almost gentle in its cruelty, then neither will the child who stole it from me. Theron reached them before he finished the sentence. He hit Garrick with the full weight of 6 months of banked fury finally given somewhere to land, and the corridor dissolved into a blur of fists and snarled breath, brutal in a way Theron rarely allowed himself to be. Garrick fought back with the desperation of a man who understood he had nothing left to lose. She was never yours to lose, Theron said, driving him back against the stone. You told yourself a story where she belonged to you, and burned 6 months of her life trying to make it true. I gave up everything for that story. You gave up nothing you didn't choose to give. The next blow ended it. Garrick crumpled against the wall, finally, completely beaten. Theron turned, and found Hannah gone very still, one hand pressed low against her belly, her face suddenly pale in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Theron, water pooled at her feet. Every trace of battle fury drained out of him at once. He crossed to her in 2 strides and lifted her before she could argue, and the fate of the fortress simply stopped mattering to him at all. Guards could hold the walls. Only one thing inside them required him now. He carried her to the healer's chambers himself, refusing every hand that offered to take her, and stayed exactly where she asked, beside her, her fingers crushing his, the storm outside roaring louder than the battle ever had. "Don't let go," she gasped, somewhere in the worst of it, when storm and pain had tangled together until she could no longer tell one from the other. "Never," he said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything. Their son arrived, as the storm broke, his first cry cutting through the wind, like something sent to answer it. The healer laid him against Hannah's chest, dark-haired already, unmistakably his father's son, blinking his mother's striking eyes open into the candlelight. "Casimir," Hannah whispered. "Casimir Varkesh." The name settled over the quiet room like something sacred. Casimir Varkesh, owed to no story that came before him, only to the boy who would write his own. Theron reached out and touched his son's small hand, and the feared Alpha King, who had never once wept in front of his own court, broke apart completely, silent tears falling as he pressed his forehead to Hannah's. "You gave me a family," he said. "No." Her tired smile was the most radiant thing he'd ever seen. "We made one." By morning, word had already outrun the storm, carried by riders, by pack bond, by the kind of joy that travels faster than any horse. The royal heir had been born. Bells rang in villages that had never once cheered for a king, and for the first time anyone could remember, the kingdom celebrated something it hadn't been ordered to. One final ceremony still waited, and this time, Hannah would not stand at the edge of the hall. 6 months of change had reshaped more than the fortress. Hannah walked its halls now, with Casimir settled against her hip, her steps sure over stone that had once made her feel like a trespasser. The council chamber no longer fell silent with judgment when she entered. It fell silent to listen. The ledgers she'd once balanced in secret for a dying estate now shaped decrees that reached every corner of the kingdom. Garrick's judgment had come 3 months earlier, delivered before the full court, with none of the mercy he'd once denied her. Stripped of his titles, his crimes against the crown, and against her recorded permanently in the royal archive, he would spend what remained of his life somewhere far from any hall he'd once ruled. Stormfang itself had been reorganized under stewards loyal to the crown. Its diverted grain and hoarded wealth returned to the villages that had gone hungry, while its lords grew fat. It wasn't vengeance, Hannah had insisted. It was correction, long overdue. Now the kingdom gathered for something else entirely. Her ceremonial gown had been a season in the making. Deep turquoise silk layered beneath silver thread, obsidian beading tracing the royal wolf crest across her bodice, the same color she'd once worn as a mark of shame, reborn as something that caught candlelight like armor. She studied her reflection a long moment before the coronation, remembering the frayed, hastily altered dress she'd worn into Moonstone Hall, and felt no trace of that frightened woman looking back at her now. The Hall of Moonstone had been transformed for the occasion, banners of black and flame hanging beside silver and turquoise, for the first time in the kingdom's history. The same nobles who had once lined its walls to watch her humiliation filled it again, some kneeling the moment she entered, some unable to lift their eyes to her at all, a few still wearing the brittle smiles of people recalculating exactly how much they'd once risked by laughing. Theron waited for her at the dais, and when she reached him, he took her hand in front of the entire assembled kingdom. 6 months ago, I searched every territory I ruled for a woman I refused to believe I'd lost, he said, his voice carrying to the furthest corner of the hall. This is that woman. His hand tightened around hers. This is the mother of my heir. A pause, weighted with everything the hall had once denied her. This is my love. No laughter answered him this time, only silence, and beneath it, something that might have been shame finally landing where it belonged. When it came time for Hannah to speak, she looked out over the same faces that had once watched her stand alone and unwanted, and found she carried no desire to make them suffer for it. I stood in this hall once, as someone you'd decided was already ruined, she said. I won't rule by making anyone else feel what that cost me. Her voice steadied, carrying easily now, nothing left in it that needed to tremble. Omegas, in this kingdom, will no longer be treated as property to be claimed or discarded. Pregnant women will not be abandoned to public shame for circumstances they didn't create alone. Noble blood will no longer decide whose justice matters and whose doesn't. Children will not inherit the cruelty of their parents' choices, and no one will be destroyed simply because this kingdom once decided they were too weak to matter. The hall remained silent, but it was a different silence now, the kind that follows a vow rather than a verdict. Standing there with the weight of the crown still settling over her, she let herself remember, just once more, the woman who'd stood outside these same doors, with trembling hands and a belly she'd been taught to hide. She remembered believing her child was the proof of her ruin. She looked down now at Casimir, dark-haired and wide-eyed against her shoulder, and understood at last how completely that belief had been wrong. The child they had called a bastard had become the heir who would inherit this hall. The Omega they had cast out had become the queen who now stood inside it. And the woman they had tried to break had become the one who would decide what kind of kingdom her son inherited. When the ceremony finally ended and the hall began to empty, Theron found her near the same doors where he'd first seen her frozen in candlelight. He touched her cheek, gentle as he'd been every day since. "Are you happy, my love?" Hannah leaned into his palm, Casimir stirring softly between them, and smiled in a way she hadn't known how to before he'd found her. "I am home." He kissed her forehead, slow and unhurried, and Casimir made a small, contented sound against his mother's shoulder, as though he understood exactly what that word meant now. Outside, beneath a clearing winter sky, the fortress wolves began to howl, low at first, then rising together into something that sounded almost like celebration. Inside the hall, every noble who remained sank to their knees. Once, they had laughed when the pregnant Omega walked through those doors. Now, every wolf in the kingdom bowed when their queen walked through them instead. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.